The past often leaves behind pointers to unfamiliar history, compelling stories of remarkable feats and rare achievements. The Travancore Observatory is one such. Commissioned in 1837, this was the second modern astronomical observatory in India, a facility that was far ahead of its time.
I would mark the observatory as one of the modern science institutions in southern Kerala, surely, perhaps for the whole Kerala. You are actually tracing back to the root of modern science and education in Trivandrum and southern Kerala.
An observatory was something which was perhaps not thought of before and not thought of after also. This stood like an isolated landmark.
From being a place of such rare distinction, the observatory now rests in a state of slumber. This is an attempt to tell the story of the Travancore Observatory, its remarkable journey through the past 180 years. Like the rest of India, the southern state of Kerala was also once divided into princely states. In the decades preceding independence, Kerala was an amalgam of 3 different territories: the states of Travancore, Cochin, and Malabar. The kingdom of Travancore stretched from the southern tip of Kanyakumari to the central regions of modern Kerala. From the long succession of kings of the Travancore dynasty, there is one name that gained much public acclaim than any other: Maharaja Swathi Thirunal Ramavarma. Born to Queen Gauri Lakshmi Bai and Rajaraja Varma Koil Thamburan, Swathi Thirunal was deemed a prodigy with exceptional talent in many fields. In 1829, at the age of 16, Swathi Thirunal ascended the throne of Travancore, becoming a benevolent and extraordinarily far-sighted ruler. The world today knows Swathi Thirunal as a prolific composer of music and a great patron of the arts. What is perhaps less known is the deep fascination that the Maharaja had for science, mathematics, and linguistics.
He was one of those people who became a scholar at a very young age and continued till the early middle age when the curtain fell. He had very great interest in linguistics, in science, and he was a particularly accomplished astronomer. He knew astrology, he knew the intricacies of language, the dry aspects of language, not the flowery aspects of language.
In the early 1830s, the young Swathi Thirunal met John Caldecott, an Englishman who was working as a commercial agent of the government of Travancore at Alapura.
Swathi Thirunal was a person of varied interest in science, in philosophy, in all languages and in history. So he was naturally enthused to see that Caldecott had his own personal arrangements for studying astronomy with some small astronomical instruments. He invited Caldecott to Trivandrum.
A lateritic hillock was chosen to build the facility. At an altitude of 200 feet, the hillock offered, back in those days, a nearly unobstructed view of the sky. It is where the observatory stands even today, except for the trees and tall buildings that surround it. Lieutenant William Henry Horsley was given charge of constructing the observatory building. Horsley was an architect and engineer with the Travancore government. His book, Memoir of Travancore, published by the government press in 1839, contains historical records of the state of Travancore of that period. Besides the observatory, Horsley's landmark engineering work is the bridge over Karamana River, built during the 1840s. The bridge still retains a lot of its original structure. Within a few years, the observatory was able to publish, with the help of the Travancore government press, a catalogue of planetary positions for the local sky. To strengthen the observatory's scientific research, Caldecott decided to travel to England and procure the most modern optical instruments. In December of 1838, Caldecott sailed for England. This transit telescope was one of the instruments that Caldecott brought from England. The side-reel clock was also purchased during that time. Caldecott carried out several meteorological and astronomical observations from Trivandrum. There are records that refer to his observations of the solar eclipse of December 21, 1843. He also computed the orbital elements of the comets that appeared in the sky in 1843 and 1845. A year later, Caldecott sailed to England one more time to urge the scientific community in England to publish his observations. His attempts were unsuccessful. In 1847, Maharaja Swathi Thirunal undertook the effort to publish, through the Travancore government press, Caldecott's works. During Caldecott's time, 2 major volumes of planetary positions were also published from the observatory.
Thirunal was a student of science and he was an elected fellow of the British Society for Advancement of Sciences. And Caldecott says that Thirunal used to read the proceedings of the Royal Astronomical Society and compare the results, possibly the position of stars and all, with the traditional Indian calculation, the Jyotisha calculation. In fact, the observatory was called the Jyotishalayam. If you look at the plaque erected at the top of the observatory, there is a Malayalam and English one. In the Malayalam one, it is called Jyotishalayam. Because in India, astrology and astronomy were not two subjects. They were actually one and the same.
In December of 1846, Maharaja Swathi Thirunal passed away. Three years later, on the 17th of December 1849, Caldecott also died. He was buried on the grounds of the Christ Church in Trivandrum, where his tomb is still present. Following Maharaja Swathi Thirunal's death, his younger brother Uttram Thirunal Martandavarma assumed the role of Travancore king. A progressive ruler, much like his brother, Uttram Thirunal continued to support the activities of the observatory. In 1851, the state of Travancore sent an invitation to John Allen Brune, the director of the prestigious Magnetic Observatory in Scotland, to take charge of the Travancore Observatory. To persuade Brune, the state offered him a hefty sum as a monthly salary. Brune took over as director of the observatory the very next year. This building, on the observatory hill itself, was where John Allen Brune stayed during his tenure as director of the observatory. The mansion was built for Allen Brune to use as his residential quarters. Brune was primarily interested in geomagnetic studies. Research on terrestrial magnetism of that time was primarily to understand how the strength of the magnetic field varied from the equator to higher latitudes and elevations. It required simultaneous measurements of the magnetic field strength from two different locations. In consultation with the local people, Brune identified the Agasthyar Peak as the second spot for his observations. At 6,200 feet above sea level, the Agasthyar Peak is the highest point on the Western Ghats. It was a daunting challenge to mount an observing station on the Agasthyar Peak, a place that was inaccessible back then as it is even now.
Those days, to go to the hilltop, you would have to actually cut the thick forest and create a path before you can start walking. And for that you would be given, the government would give him convicts from the jail, possibly in chains. Then they would be let out first, and they would have to clear the area, the path for 1 kilometer or so. Then they have to come back. Then they take this luggage and then take them forward 1 kilometer, then build another place, and that is how it went. This is all very graphically described in many writings by Allen Brune.
With support from the local people, Brune undertook an arduous journey of several days wading through the wilderness. An observing station was finally built on the peak, where Allen Brune stayed with his local help for several weeks at a stretch. What happened to the observing station at the summit is not documented. The station was likely to be of wood, as it was meant for magnetic observations. From the sketchy descriptions available, this area near to the summit of the Agasthyar Peak might have been the location of the observing station. The wooden structure is likely to have perished over time in the heavy winds and humid weather conditions. Allen Brune was also an ardent observer of nature. From the vantage ground of the Agasthyar Peak, Brune chronicled in fine detail the arrival of the monsoons and the shuffling moods of nature. As the years went by, the funding for the observatory dwindled due to a lack of patronage. One finds in the Travancore administration report references to the observatory as a costly establishment of little general interest to the people. By the early 1860s, the observatory activities had drastically shrunk. Allen Brune retired from the directorship of the observatory in 1869 and moved back to England with a lifetime pension from the Raja of Travancore. 10 years later, he died at his home in Devonshire, England. The scientific works of Allen Brune of nearly 15 years, carried out from the Travancore Observatory, were published by the Travancore Government Press and by the Royal Society of Edinburgh and London in its transactions. After Alan Brune, the observatory maintained a very low profile, sustaining with bare essential magnetic and meteorological observations.
ഈ തിരുവാങ്കൂറിൻ്റെ പല ഭാഗങ്ങളിലും പിൽക്കാലത്ത് തിരുക്കൊച്ചിയുടെ പല ഭാഗങ്ങളിലും പിന്നെ മലബാറിലെ പല ഭാഗങ്ങളിലും ഉണ്ടാകുന്ന മഴയുടെ അളവ് രേഖപ്പെടുത്തിയിരുന്നത് തിരുവനന്തപുരം ഒബ്സർവേറ്ററിയിലാണ്. 3 ഇഞ്ചിൽ കൂടുതൽ മഴ പെയ്തു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ആ വിവരം ടെലിഗ്രാമായിട്ടാണ് ഇവിടെ അറിയിച്ചിരുന്നത്. ഈ വിവരം റവന്യൂ ബോർഡിലേക്ക് കൈമാറുമായിരുന്നു.
The rainfall measurements were telegrammed to the Shimla Meteorological Office in Pune, now known as the Indian Meteorological Department. Astronomical observations were largely restricted to standardizing the local time by looking at the transit of stars. For nearly 25 years, the observatory continued this way at a reduced scale. In 1890, Dr. Alexander Kirkton Mitchell, a professor of mathematics and physics at the University College of Travancore, volunteered to take charge of the observatory. Mitchell, dismayed at the rundown condition of the observatory and the inaccuracy of data collection, started his own efforts to improve the situation. He took up residence at the Rose House, not far from the observatory hills. A main activity of the observatory during Mitchell's time was the signalling of time as measured from the transit of stars. Every day at precisely 11 a.m., time was communicated by waving a flag from the top of the observatory to be seen by the Naya Brigade, the official army of Travancore camped at the brigade ground. The Naya Brigade would in turn fire cannon shots at midday, at 8 p.m. and at 5 a.m. the next day to signal time to the residents of the capital.
അന്നത്തെ ഒബ്സർവേറ്ററിയുടെ ഒരു പ്രധാന ആക്ടിവിറ്റി നക്ഷത്രങ്ങളുടെ ചലനം നിർണയിച്ച് കൃത്യമായ സമയം രേഖപ്പെടുത്തുക എന്നുള്ളതായിരുന്നു. 1943 തിരുവനന്തപുരത്ത് ഒരു റേഡിയോ ബ്രോഡ്കാസ്റ്റിംഗ് സ്റ്റേഷൻ ആരംഭിച്ചത്. ആ റേഡിയോ ബ്രോഡ്കാസ്റ്റിംഗ് സ്റ്റേഷനിലേക്ക് വേണ്ട കൃത്യമായ സമയം ഒബ്സർവേറ്ററിയാണ് നൽകിയിരുന്നത്.
Today, the brigade ground cannot be seen from the observatory because of the tall trees and building structures that have come in between. This method of signalling time was rather crude. It was soon realized that the signalling was off on most occasions by several minutes. Taking cue from the practice followed at the Madras Observatory, Mitchell requested that the gunfire mechanism be automated with the help of electrical systems connected to clocks. Records indicate that such an electrical time gun firing apparatus was procured from overseas. Further details are missing, except that it was installed sometime in 1897. For the many years that followed, the observatory continued to serve as a beacon for signalling time. From 1910 to 1927, the observatory saw a number of honorary directors. In 1931, the observatory building had to be dismantled to make room for the construction of a high-level reservoir for distributing water in the town. What we see as the observatory now is a newer structure built soon after in a spot adjacent to the reservoir. This vintage 5-inch equatorial telescope from the early years of the observatory was shifted to the roof of the newly built reservoir, where one can find it even now. In 1937, the University of Travancore was established by the Maharaja of Travancore, Sri Chittra Thirunal Balarama Varma. The observatory was transferred to the control of the new university. In the years that followed, the observatory sustained itself with routine measurements, but it had its occasional share of excitement. On a routine January morning in 1941, Subramania Iyer and the night assistant professor Kuttan Nair chanced upon a curious object in the sky. The source was unknown to catalogues. By the time the finding could be scribbled and telegrammed to the Royal Greenwich Observatory, astronomers from other parts of the world had taken priority for independently discovering the new comet. After Subramania Iyer's retirement, Professor Kuttan Nair was made in charge of the observatory.
When I first got to Trivandrum in the 60s, the first thing I did was go and find this observatory, which is so famous. And there I found Kuttan Nair. Professor Kuttan Nair was there almost alone in that place. And then we started talking about astronomy and got interested in that. And from there on, we had a few interactions with him. And even on the same day evening, I think we used the 4-inch telescope out on the terrace to see Venus and all that.
Dr. Vikram Sarabhai was perhaps one of the last big names to make important use of the facility. Sarabhai in the early 1960s was running an experimental campaign from India to study cosmic rays from outer space. Along with Dr. G. Lakshmana Pai, many scientific papers were written from here that received worldwide attention. The observatory's hilly location was deemed ideal for his experiments. Sarabhai's Cosmic Research Laboratory functioned from the observatory for several years. Untended for years, obscured by time, the observatory of 2 centuries has lost much. As the city grew around it, the surroundings became strongly lit up by stray light, making scientifically worthwhile astronomical observations impossible. But even now, a visit to the place on any day can leave us amazed, like opening a lost treasure chest of history.
Legacy is the Maharaja's vision of a new world where modern science plays an important part in the, not only in technical, from the technical point of view, but from the cultural aspect. You know, a rational philosophy which is required for the modern state. And that is great at the time when he did it, because that is in the middle of the 19th century. So when Travancore was a very fairly primitive state, this vision, the visionary Swathi Thirunal, and that legacy is really grand on that scale. We have done great things in the past, but unfortunately not kept up with it in the present.
Grown out of its need, or perhaps overshadowed by its own rich legacy, the observatory seems like a place lost to memory. Looking ahead into the future, it is for us to decide how to preserve the legacy of this facility that once nurtured the scientific creativity of many great minds.